I never thought a children's playground would become the reason an entire homeowners association nearly lost control of its own neighborhood. But life has a funny way of reminding people that arrogance is expensive. Looking back now, the sound I remember most isn't the arguing or the lawyers or even the jackhammers tearing everything apart. It's the laughter of kids echoing across land that never belonged to the people who built that playground in the first place. And every time I hear children playing somewhere else now, I think about how one careless decision by a group of confident adults turned into the biggest legal disaster our county had seen in years. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 49 years old, and I've spent almost 3 decades working as a professional land surveyor across central Kansas, which means I make my living measuring things other people assume they already understand. Property lines don't care about opinions, popularity, or expensive neighborhoods. They sit quietly in the ground, waiting for somebody foolish enough to ignore them. The neighborhood surrounding my place looked like something straight out of a luxury real estate brochure. Stone entrance gates, decorative ponds, electric vehicle charging stations, perfectly trimmed lawns where nobody seemed to own a weed, and little white golf carts floating through the streets like they belonged in a retirement commercial. My property sat on the northern edge of all that perfection. 13 acres of old prairie grass, cedar trees, and gravel roads that had been there since my grandfather's time. I liked it that way. My closest neighbors joked that my place looked like the last stubborn piece of old Kansas refusing to surrender to modern development. And honestly, they weren't wrong. The developers had bought almost everything around us years earlier, built hundreds of expensive homes, then formed an HOA that seemed to believe it governed the entire universe. The only problem for them was that my family never joined. My grandfather bought our land decades before anyone dreamed about gated communities or architectural committees, and every deed transfer afterward preserved the same rights. We smiled, waved at neighbors, paid our taxes, fixed our fences, and lived our lives. I figured that was enough. Apparently, the HOA leadership disagreed. It started with little things. One board member mailed me a letter suggesting I paint my old equipment shed because visitors entering the subdivision could see it from the road. I tossed the letter into my wood stove. Another time, someone complained that my tractor was visible from a walking trail. I laughed because the tractor had been sitting there longer than half the houses existed. Then they asked if I would consider installing decorative landscaping to better match the community image. Community image. I wasn't even part of their community. I remember telling my buddy Rick over coffee at the diner, one day these people are going to forget where their authority ends. He stirred his coffee and smiled. Then make sure you're standing there when they do. Neither of us knew how prophetic that would become. The Tuesday, everything changed started like any other. I was checking boundary markers after a weekend storm because heavy rain can shift surface references and old habits die hard when surveying is your profession. About halfway down my northern line, I noticed bright orange stakes sticking out of the ground. At first, I assumed a utility company had scheduled maintenance, but then I heard diesel engines idling beyond the trees. As I walked closer, I saw 2 excavators, a concrete truck, pallets of playground equipment still wrapped in plastic, and half a dozen workers moving around with clipboards. One man was directing another toward a section of my property where fresh paint marked a rectangle across the grass. I stopped, looked at my GPS coordinates, checked the monument marker buried decades earlier, and my stomach sank because there was no mistake. They weren't close to my line. They were over it. I walked toward the foreman and asked, "Morning. Mind telling me what you're building?" Without looking up, he answered, "Community playground. Should be finished next week if the weather cooperates." I pointed toward the ground beneath his boots. "You know whose land you're standing on?" He shrugged. "HOA property, that's what we were told." I smiled the way people smile when they already know something the other person doesn't. "No, sir. That's mine." He finally looked at me, confused enough to glance around as though invisible property lines might suddenly appear in the dirt. He called another supervisor over, and the second man unfolded a development map. He traced his finger across colorful lots and sidewalks before saying, "Our office approved this location." I replied, "Interesting. Did my office approve it?" He frowned. "And who would that be?" I held out my hand. The owner. For about 5 seconds, nobody said anything. Then one worker quietly shut off an excavator while another pretended to organize tools. The foreman cleared his throat and said, "You'll have to speak with the HOA board." I nodded. I planned to. Before leaving, I walked the entire construction area, measuring every intrusion. For feet here, 7 feet there, nearly 18 feet at the deepest point where they intended to pour the safety surface beneath climbing structures. They had invested thousands of dollars before bothering to verify ownership. Driving home, I wasn't angry anymore. I was curious because people rarely make mistakes that large without confidence protecting them, and confidence has a way of collapsing when it meets documentation. That afternoon, I unlocked an old filing cabinet my father used to call the family memory box, pulled out yellow deeds, survey plats, mineral reservations, and handwritten notes from transactions older than I was. I thought I was simply gathering proof of ownership. I had no idea I was about to discover a forgotten clause that would change everything. I spread every document across my dining room table that evening. And for the first time in years, the place looked less like a home and more like the office where I started my career. Old survey maps overlapped faded warranty deeds. Coffee rings covered county plats that my father had drawn by hand decades earlier. And there I was with a yellow legal pad, reading every line as if someone had hidden a message inside the paperwork. Most people think property deeds are boring, but surveyors know they're like biographies. They tell you where a place came from, who fought over it, what was sold, what was kept, and sometimes what everybody forgot. Around 9 that night, I found a folded attachment stapled behind an amendment from the late 1970s. The paper was brittle enough that I unfolded it carefully, and there it was, a mineral reservation clause that had survived every transfer inside my family. I read it once, then again, then a third time because I honestly thought I was misunderstanding it. The surface belonged to us, obviously, but the document also preserved extensive subsurface development rights together with extraction access and operational protections extending across designated portions of the property. I leaned back in my chair and laughed to myself. Not because I planned on digging a mine. I had absolutely no interest in becoming a mining operator. What made me laugh was realizing that whoever planned that playground had probably spent months arguing over slide colors and landscaping while never paying attention to the one paragraph that actually mattered. The next morning, I called an old acquaintance named Walter Briggs, a retired attorney who specialized in land and resource law, before he finally escaped into fishing full-time. He answered on the third ring. "Ethan, if you're calling before 8 in the morning, either you're getting married or somebody did something stupid." I said, "Definitely the second one." We met at a cafe near the county courthouse where I slid the documents across the table. Walter read silently while drinking coffee, occasionally making a noise somewhere between a chuckle and a cough. Finally, he looked at me and asked, "Tell me honestly, are they already building?" I nodded. Concrete trucks were there yesterday. He stared at the papers again. "Well, this is fascinating. Good fascinating or expensive fascinating." He smiled. "Depend which side you're on." For nearly an hour, he explained the practical realities. The clause itself did not magically make me rich or give me permission to bulldoze neighborhoods, but it did establish rights that any future development would have to recognize. More importantly, if legitimate extraction activity were initiated under the proper regulatory framework, structures interfering with those rights could become major legal and insurance liabilities. Walter tapped the paper and said, "Most people assume land ownership stops at the grass. It doesn't. Sometimes the real value is underneath." I drove straight to the state resource office expecting bureaucracy, delays, and endless paperwork. Instead, I met a woman named Denise who had worked there for 25 years and treated every question like a puzzle she wanted to solve. I explained the situation without exaggerating anything. She reviewed maps, checked registrations, pulled historical records, and finally asked, "Are you considering resource development?" I answered carefully, "I'm considering protecting my legal rights." She nodded because she understood exactly what I meant. Over the next several days, I completed forms, submitted engineering references, documented access routes, and complied with every procedural requirement they requested. Every signature mattered because I wasn't interested in intimidation. I wanted everything done by the book. Meanwhile, construction continued. From my porch, I could hear machinery all afternoon. Trucks came and went carrying playground equipment, while workers joked and smoked cigarettes like it was just another project. Every evening, I walked my fence line and watched the structure grow taller. Bright blue climbing bars appeared, then swings, then a little castle-shaped platform that children would probably love. A part of me actually hated where this was going because none of this was the kids' fault. Adults had created the problem, but eventually children would lose the place they expected to enjoy. That bothered me more than anything. Friday afternoon, my phone rang. Denise spoke in the calm voice government employees somehow master after decades of dealing with panic. Mr. Caldwell, your operational filing has been accepted. Additional notices will be distributed according to procedure. I thanked her and hung up before sitting in silence for several minutes. The paperwork had moved farther than I expected. There was no dramatic music, no celebration, just an ordinary phone call that quietly shifted the balance of power. On Monday morning, certified notices went out to the appropriate county offices and interested parties. I mailed copies where required and kept duplicates inside a binder. Rick stopped by that afternoon carrying sandwiches and asked, "So what happens now?" I shrugged. "Now everybody reads." He laughed. "You really think they will?" "No," I said, "but their insurance companies definitely will." 3 days later, the first crack appeared. My mailbox contained a letter requesting additional clarification from an insurance investigator regarding structures located within the affected operational area. That same evening, I noticed 2 unfamiliar SUVs parked beside the playground, while several people in business clothes walked around taking photographs. Nobody was smiling anymore. The following afternoon, a woman walking her dog waved me down near the road. I'd seen her around, but never spoken with her before. "Excuse me," she said nervously. "Is it true somebody is opening a quarry behind the subdivision?" I answered honestly. "It's true, I exercised legal rights connected to my property." Her eyes widened. "Will there be blasting?" "I haven't said there will be." "Then why is everyone talking about it?" I smiled politely. "Because rumors travel faster than paperwork." By the weekend, the neighborhood social media page exploded. One homeowner insisted heavy machinery would destroy property values. Another blamed environmental regulations. Someone else claimed the county had secretly approved industrial development years earlier. Then the accusations started flying toward the HOA board. Why wasn't this researched? Who approved the location? Did anyone verify the boundary? The board responded with vague statements about ongoing discussions, which only made people angrier. Monday morning, I drove past the clubhouse and noticed the parking lot overflowing with vehicles. Homeowners stood outside arguing in clusters while board members hurried inside, avoiding eye contact. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a man introducing himself as the HOA president. Daniel Harper, a name I knew because he'd signed several of those annoying letters over the years about appearances and neighborhood standards. His voice sounded completely different now. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the polished authority. "Mr. Caldwell," he began, "I think we've had a misunderstanding." I looked out my window toward the playground and replied, "Interesting choice of words." He continued, "Perhaps we could meet and discuss options that benefit everyone." I said, "You're welcome to come by tomorrow morning." He arrived exactly at 9, wearing an expensive suit that looked miserable under the Kansas heat. He shook my hand with the forced smile of a man trying to negotiate with consequences. We sat on my porch, overlooking the same land his organization had treated like spare space. He cleared his throat. Our board never intended to create conflict. Yet here we are. The contractor believed. I interrupted gently. Contractors build. Boards approve. Let's not confuse the two. He shifted in his chair. Surely there's room for compromise. I stood, walked inside, and returned with a folder containing photographs, surveys, correspondence, and an itemized estimate prepared by professionals. I placed down the table between us. He opened it slowly. His face changed with every page. Relocation costs, restoration costs, long-term access agreements, future approval provisions. He reached the final sheet and whispered, "This can't be serious." I answered, "It's completely serious. You built first and asked questions never." He rubbed his forehead and asked for time. I looked across the field where children had started gathering with their parents, laughing beneath equipment that suddenly existed inside a legal storm none of them understood. Time, I told him quietly, was available before the concrete trucks arrived. Now, every day this remains unresolved creates larger risks for everyone involved. He left without another argument, carrying the folder under his arm like it weighed 100 pounds, and as his SUV disappeared down the road, I realized something important. Until that moment, the HOA thought this was a disagreement between one stubborn landowner and a powerful association. They were finally beginning to understand that the real conflict wasn't with me at all. It was between their own decisions and the consequences those decisions had set into motion, and the next few days would force every homeowner in that subdivision to choose which side of that reality they wanted to stand on. The next 48 hours changed the mood of that entire subdivision faster than any lawsuit ever could. People who had never cared where a property line sat suddenly wanted maps, copies of deeds, engineering reports, and answers from anyone willing to provide them. My phone stayed surprisingly quiet, but Rick called 3 times just to laugh and asked if I had become the most unpopular man in the county. I told him popularity had never been part of my business plan. Accuracy was. By Wednesday evening, however, something happened that even I hadn't expected. A local insurance representative stopped by my property and politely asked whether I would confirm the boundaries shown on the submitted documents. We walked the line together, checking markers that had been in the ground longer than many of the homeowners had been alive. He took photographs, thanked me for my time, and before leaving he said something that stuck with me. People usually think risk comes from storms or fires. Sometimes it comes from paperwork nobody bothered to read. The following morning, the panic finally reached the neighborhood. Homeowners gathered outside the clubhouse before sunrise, talking in nervous circles while board members rushed between cars carrying folders and laptops. I later learned that questions surrounding liability and operational conflicts had triggered serious concerns among insurers, lenders, and legal advisors. Suddenly, nobody wanted to pretend the problem would solve itself. Parents worried about children getting hurt on equipment sitting in disputed space. Retired couples worried about property values. Young families wondered why they were hearing more information from rumors than from the people they elected to run the association. That afternoon, Daniel Harper returned, except this time he didn't arrive alone. 2 attorneys, a property consultant, and another board member walked onto my porch with expressions that suggested nobody had slept much the night before. Daniel spoke first. "Mr. Caldwell, we'd like to resolve this today." I invited them to sit. One attorney immediately began explaining how misunderstandings happen during development projects and how cooperation benefits everyone. I listened patiently until he finished. Then I slid a stack of documents across the table and said, "You're absolutely right. Cooperation benefits everyone. That's why property owners usually get asked before construction begins." The consultant studied the surveys and quietly whispered to one of the attorneys. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. Their faces said enough. Daniel finally looked at me and asked, "If the structures are removed, what would it take to settle everything?" I answered calmly, because anger would only weaken the point. "First, complete restoration of my property at your expense. Second, reimbursement for damages and professional costs. Third, any future structure affecting my land requires my written approval under a long-term agreement." The room became silent. One attorney leaned back and sighed. "That's a substantial request." I smiled. "So is building a playground on land you didn't own." They asked for a private discussion and stepped into the yard. Through the window, I watched 4 professionals arguing while pointing toward maps and photographs. Daniel kept removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes. The consultant repeatedly shook his head. After nearly 30 minutes, they returned. "We'll recommend acceptance to the board," Daniel said quietly, "but homeowners will demand explanations." I nodded. "Then give them honest ones." The emergency meeting that night reportedly lasted for hours. Neighbors who had never questioned the board stood up and demanded accountability. One resident asked why surveys had never been verified. Another asked who approved spending association money without confirming ownership. Someone else reportedly shouted, "We trusted you because we thought you checked these things." For the first time since this whole mess started, the discussion wasn't about me. It was about responsibility. 2 days later, demolition crews rolled in before sunrise. I stood near my fence with a cup of coffee while machines that had proudly built the playground now carefully dismantled it piece by piece. Swings disappeared first, then slides, then climbing walls. Jackhammers broke apart fresh concrete that hadn't even weathered a full season. Dust floated through the morning air while workers loaded debris into trucks under the watch of engineers and inspectors documenting every step. A little boy holding his father's hand looked toward the empty space and asked, "Why are they taking it away?" His father hesitated before answering, "Because somebody built it where they shouldn't have." That simple sentence carried more wisdom than every argument I'd heard over the previous weeks. By the end of the following week, restoration work had begun. Fresh soil replaced damaged ground. Boundary markers were reinforced, and the association delivered certified payment covering the agreed costs along with a signed long-term agreement establishing future approval procedures. Daniel personally handed me the envelope. He looked exhausted, older somehow. "I wish we'd handled this differently," he admitted. I accepted the documents and replied, "So do I. You could have knocked on my door the first day." He gave a tired laugh. "You're probably right. I know I'm right," I answered, and for the first time since we'd met, he smiled honestly instead of politically. Months later, grass covered the restored area again, and if you drove past my property, you might never guess the conflict had happened. The neighborhood built a new playground entirely on its own land after obtaining proper approvals, and from what I hear, the kids love it. I don't resent that. Children deserve places to play. What they don't deserve is to become part of adults' pride and shortcuts. Looking back, I never wanted revenge, and I certainly never dreamed of becoming the villain in someone's neighborhood Facebook group. All I wanted was the same respect every property owner deserves. Funny enough, the strongest tool I ever used wasn't heavy equipment, a courtroom speech, or a threat. It was patience, documentation, and the willingness to let facts speak louder than emotions. Even today, people ask me if I would do it all again, and my answer surprises them. I'd rather have shared a cup of coffee and a simple conversation before the first shovel touched the ground. That would have saved everyone money, stress, and embarrassment. But once someone decides your rights are optional, defending them becomes your responsibility. So now I want to hear from you. If you were in my position, would you have accepted an apology and let the playground stay? Or would you have stood your ground the way I did? And if you were one of those homeowners, who would you blame most, the landowner protecting his rights, or the leaders who assumed they could build first and ask permission later? Share your opinion in the comments, because stories like this aren't really about property lines at all. They're about where fairness ends and accountability begins.